We all know that communication is the lifeblood of any good relationship. However, it's not the sole determinant of happiness, but it definitely brings profound benefits and improved connection.
Words can be magic at the right time, but they can also be misconstrued.
Absolutely.
And it's not uncommon for couples to be hearing things that are wildly different from what their partner is actually trying to say. And these miscommunications are often the cause of unnecessary hurt and pain.
In today's episode, we're going to talk about a few critical differences in listening and speaking styles that are often culprits for these miscommunications. Coming up in today's episode of Master Your Marriage. Welcome back to another episode. If this is your first time joining the show, welcome. We thank you for being here. Make sure that while you're here, you smash that subscribe button because we drop a new episode every Wednesday and we wouldn't want you to miss one.
And also remember, you can also leave a question or a comment for us for the podcast by calling us at 801-669-8513. And just as a reminder, you guys, if you are getting value out of these episodes, we put a lot of time in each week into preparing valuable content for you. If you are getting that value, please support the show by going ahead and leaving that 5-star rating and a written review.
Awesome. Okay, so today on episodes, and I'm sure you can relate to this, right? Have you ever had a conversation with your spouse or partner and you think, are we even speaking the same language?
Mm-hmm.
Am I even getting through to this person?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, always.
Oh, right. And the truth is that sometimes we're not speaking the same language.
Right.
Sometimes what one person is saying and what the other person is hearing are two totally different things.
Why is this? Why does this always happen?
Well, first off, there's lots of different reasons, but
Right.
words themselves have different meanings for different people. I've done this experiment at a lot of our trainings, and I'll say something like, oh, okay, so everybody write down 5 words that mean the same thing as sex to you.
I remember this.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you have everybody write down 5 words that describe it. And it doesn't matter how many people are in the room. There could be 5 people in the room or 500 people in the room. We've never had it where 2 people in that room write down the same description in the same order ever.
Yeah.
Because
without a doubt.
even something as simple as that is defined so differently by everyone.
And that's what it means with, words have so many different meanings, and how we use those words is so important.
And so this is one of the many reasons why we experience these miscommunications.
Yeah. And on top of words having different meanings to different people, we all internally sort information differently. Our brain deletes and distorts and generalizes the information that we see and hear that's all around us. And this causes us to miss these crucial big chunks of information that are trying to get into this central processing unit.
Exactly. And as we've said before, neuroscience has shown that our brain is actually filtering information because we actually can't really take in or perceive everything that's going on around us at any given time. There's just too much data that's coming in through those 5 senses, and we can't consciously pay attention to all of it.
And in fact, our sensory systems are really actually pretty slow when it comes to sort of recognizing input. What we're currently experiencing is actually happening about 50 to 100 milliseconds previous to when we actually realize that. And that's why we can't really pay attention to everything. That's why reactions are so unique. When people say like, oh, I reacted even before I saw the thing that happened to me.
Right.
It's because your system is running just a little bit too slow by the time we reaches our awareness.
Exactly.
So our brain and our mind has to filter all of this data, and it filters it, and it creates this individual and unique reality based on our experiences for each one of us.
Right. And this reminds me of a quote that I really always like to try to remember. And it's from Patrick Kavanagh, who's a renowned neuroscientist and researcher at Dartmouth College. And he said that it is really important for us to understand that we're actually not seeing a true reality. We're seeing a story that has been created for us in our mind.
So why is this good information to know? Well, because as a result, each of us has a different subjective reality. One of the ways that you can see this reality is in how couples vastly differ in their speaking and listening styles. And this, of course, is the cause for so many miscommunications.
Which is why I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. We're talking today about speaking styles and listening styles. And this has been the cause of so much and contributed to so much miscommunication in our relationship and in other relationships that we've seen. And in what we're going to teach you today is some really simple concepts that you can apply right away that can help to prevent a lot of these miscommunications. So I'm excited about this episode.
Yeah. So let's begin with what? Listening styles?
Listening.
Okay.
Listening styles.
So as we listen to others, some of us listen very literally to the words that someone else might say. Other people infer or mind read about what they're hearing that has been said.
Okay, so imagine a spectrum. On one side of this spectrum, we have those who listen really super literally, like every word literally means what it says. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's those who listen extremely inferentially. So we have inferential listeners and we have literal listeners. And sometimes we're somewhere in between on that spectrum. We can also be different in different situations. So maybe at work, we're a listener. We listen in very literally, but then when we get home, we do a lot more inferring with family.
Now, ask yourself, which one are you? Are you an inferential listener or a literal listener? And here's a question you can ask yourself to maybe get an idea of which one you are. Are you ready?
Okay. You're going to ask us a quiz question?
Yeah, this is a quiz question. All right.
Okay,
if someone said to you, I'm really thirsty, would you, one, find that comment interesting, but not very compelling? Or would you feel really compelled to do something about it?
I would probably tend to be closer to number one. I think it was, right? Like, I think I would find it interesting. I don't think I would necessarily do anything about it.
Right. Feel like they had to do something about it. Okay.
So you guys answer. Would you answer number one or number two? Well, if you said number two, or if you jumped up already just at Robert's question and you ran to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, then you are an inferential listener because you inferred that Robert, when maybe he said that, wanted a glass of water, even though he didn't ask for a glass of water. Make sense?
Right. And you might be thinking, oh, that's such a sweet and kind thing for someone to do. Isn't it though?
It's such a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
It is. Go get me a glass of water.
Yeah.
Maybe I wanted it. Maybe I didn't.
Even though I didn't ask for it, really.
Right. It is a nice thing to do. However, sometimes here's the pros and cons of this. Like sometimes inferential listeners will pick up on things you never said and things that may not even be true because inferential listeners do a lot of reading between the lines and sometimes they don't get it right.
Yeah, that's a fraught for disaster kind of a situation, right? In fact, inferential listeners usually get it wrong more often than not. And then when they get it wrong, they get upset, resentful, and angry because they inferred something from this conversation that was happening or from something that somebody said, and it simply wasn't a fact. It might have just been an offhand comment.
Right, which is unfortunate because then you're getting upset about things that aren't even necessarily true because you thought that someone meant something or you thought someone felt a certain way when they really didn't.
Yeah.
So that's the inferential listener. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the literal listeners, they don't read between the lines. They would probably not get up and get that glass of water. They might say, do you want a glass of water? Just to clarify, but they wouldn't jump up and get a glass of water.
Yeah. And it's good to understand the difference because you might be actually getting mad at your spouse or partner for the things that you think that they, quote, should be reading between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, if you're actually thirsty and then you said to your literal listener spouse, I'm thirsty, and they're not jumping up to get you a glass of water and they don't even move. It's important to take a beat, not really get upset, and remember that literal listeners really need these things spelled out for them. And that's just their listening style.
Yes. So if you do want a glass of water, probably a pretty good idea to come out and request it directly. If you want a date night, then it's probably good to come right out and say it. If you
Oh,
need
we're getting
help,
into it now, aren't
if
we?
you need help with the dishes, let's just go ahead and ask and not just drop clues, right? If you want your spouse to plan a vacation, you need to come right out and say that too. So here's the point with a very literal listener partner, don't beat around the bush with them. Okay, don't. And try not to get upset when they aren't getting it because you haven't made things clear to them.
Yeah, the key is that your spouse or partner here isn't being insensitive when they aren't picking up these clues, these little breadcrumbs that you're dropping. They just need you to be more clear in your requests in order for you to get your needs met.
Yeah. See, okay. So kind of our situation, I'm not very good at reading between the lines in most contexts. I think in work I do okay, but in general conversations with people, I primarily listen in a way that's really literal. So I'm terrible at jokes. I can't tell jokes.
Absolutely.
I can't get jokes because when someone switches from talking to me literally and they switch into a joke really quick, I don't know. It's like I need someone to give me a turn signal or something. Like if you're going to tell me a joke, please tell me, here's a joke. It's coming now.
You are so bad at listening to jokes.
So, otherwise I spend forever going, wait, are we telling a joke right now? Are you being serious right now? I mean, you sent me a text the other day that was meant to be a joke. And you even told me it's a joke. Do you get it? And I'm like, no.
Yeah, I think it took you a week. You came
so
back to
bad.
it. Okay, so that was listening styles, right? So there's listening styles. And of course, now we're going to talk about speaking styles. So there are two types of speaking styles as well, right?
Okay. What are those two types?
Well, speakers can either be a literal speaker or they can be an inferential speaker.
Oh,
right?
So same thing as
same
before.
thing. Yeah. Just how we speak versus how we listen. So which are you? Another quiz. Listen to this question and think about how you might answer it. All right. So if you felt like someone around you is not performing as well as they should, would you, one, come to the point and tell them directly? Or two, would you hint and imply and maybe give them some clues that they might be able to do something better?
More breadcrumbs.
More breadcrumbs.
Okay. So again, just like with listening styles, we have literal speakers and we have inferential speakers. And again, this can be context dependent, meaning in certain situations, maybe you're really literal at work, but then when you get home, you're more inferential at home with your family.
Yeah, I'm more this way, I think. I'm usually direct and come right to the point often when I'm with my team at work or even with my patients. But in my close relationships at home, I am a whole lot more inferential, which is challenging when you're paired with our child, who's a very, very different listener than
and me sometimes being more of a literal listener, and our son who's a literal listener, that can be a little bit of like you're speaking one language and I'm speaking another language.
Yeah, I say things like, boy, it'd really be nice if you would blank. and then I get frustrated, right? I get frustrated because I wasn't clear with my request.
Well, that's silly.
It is, right? Everyone listening says that, right? Like, oh, that's silly that you got frustrated because you weren't clear with your request. I want you to think about that.
Yeah. So that reminds me of a story, and we've shared this story once before in the podcast, but it's been a long time. So I'm going to tell it again real quick. But there was a time when I was working on this really big project for a retreat that we were putting on, and I had this deadline and I was like super overwhelmed to get this job done. And Robert pops his head through the door, Mr. Inferential speaker. And he says, "Hey, I'm going to Lowe's." So similar to the cup of water, would you find that comment interesting, or do you feel compelled to jump up and do something about it? And he says, I'm going to Lowe's. And knowing now these little tips that we're sharing with you today, I paused for a moment. Okay. He's actually not just telling me he's going to Lowe's. There's an invitation in there. And so I recognized that and I got up and I went with him to Lowe's. And we've shared this story because it's an important point because he was making a bid for connection, right? It was a bid for connection, but it was done in an inferential speaking style. He didn't say, do you want to come with me? Right?
Yeah. And that's, these breadcrumbs are really dangerous when you're just sort of laying them down. So we've talked in many episodes how important it is to respond to our partner's bid for connections, right? In Dr. John Gottman's research, he studied, and we'll just review this again. He studied newlyweds and he counted how many times these newlyweds responded positively to these bids for connections. And then they followed these newlyweds over about 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, they looked at the data, which ones were still married. And he found out that the ones that were still married and happily bound together had turned toward or responded positively 86% of the time.
6 years ago.
6 years, yeah. And the ones that were divorced had only responded 33% in the data set.
6 years ago. So they rolled back the tape 6 years ago. So even 6 years out in advance, how we respond to these bids for connection are crucial. Yeah. They're so important. And I think a lot of these misses are not intentional. They're not malicious. They're not just being like you're ignoring on purpose your spouse. There's just simply this tragic mismatch in how we're communicating. One person may have been inferring what they wanted or needed, or more maybe making a bid for connection, like, hey, I'm going to Lowe's. And the other person wasn't hearing that as a bid for connection.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of these two philosophical constructs, and probably the one that's more common, the one we know, is one called Occam's razor, which is, the term for Occam's razor is the simplest explanation is usually the truth, and we've all heard that.
Yeah.
And the problem is, I'd like to just introduce you to one called another philosophical construct called Hallin's razor. Hallin's razor really says, never attribute malice to that which could be explained by, in the way they say it, that which could be explained by stupidity. But I like to say habit or indifference. So if we apply Occam's razor, right, the simplest answer must be true. Those people are literal listeners and literal speakers, right? They are going to say it. It's going to be very specific. Yet, as a literal listener or a literal speaker, we're often going to get our feelings hurt by an inferential listener, because we're going to assume, Hallin's razor here, that they are doing something to hurt us on purpose, that they're not communicating the way that they should or could, that they should know what we want, right? And in either of these situations, I'd like for us to just assume the best, instead of assuming that somebody is trying to really hurt us by withholding information or not telling us. Let's just assume that maybe it's their communication style that they're most comfortable with and the way that they communicate. So instead of going with Occam's razor, right, the simplest answer must be true, like they're trying to be mean, or they're not communicating.
Why can't they communicate like I communicate?
They're not communicating appropriately. Let's work on the other one, which is more Hallin's razor, which is, let's not just assume malice here. Let's just assume that they might have a differing communication style, and maybe we can learn something from that.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think of all the times where we've had this disconnect, in our relationship. It's like, oh, I'm going to get a drink, or I'm going to Lowe's, or I'm, and I could get upset about that and be like, well, why can't you just come out and say it?
Yeah.
And sure, that would certainly prevent miscommunications if so, but let's not get rigid in our own style to the point where we're like, you have to communicate the way that I communicate. Otherwise, I'm not listening to you.
Or even assign meaning, right?
Right.
So, and this is where it gets weird. Just because you're an inferential listener does not mean you're an inferential speaker. You can speak and listen with different styles. You can be an inferential listener and a literal speaker, or vice versa.
Yeah. And I'm that way. It's so weird that you can be one way when you're speaking and the other way when you're listening. When I'm in my head.
And get upset about someone else's communication preferences.
Exactly. I mean, when I'm in my own thoughts, I do a lot of metaphorical, sort of big picture kind of thinking, not very literal at all. But then when when I speak, even like when I'm on stage and stuff, I share metaphors, and sometimes at home I beat around the bush. I don't come directly out and say what I need sometimes. But then when I listen, I'm listening. I can't get a joke. and I'm listening totally literally,
Yeah.
right? So it's wild that we can be different.
Yeah. And oftentimes we are, right? So why is this all good to know? Well, I think, as we've learned so far, it's good to recognize the limitations on how we're currently speaking and listening. And we need to get better at finding those potential traps where miscommunication can happen most often.
And give grace,
Yeah. And give grace.
like you
Yeah.
said earlier,
Yeah. Let's not
our
assume
differences.
malice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when it comes to listening style, it's good to recognize that when you're an inferential listener, and if you're an inferential listener, it's good to remember that I probably get it wrong a lot, especially if you find yourself mind reading and saying things like, right, like, oh, this is what that meant, right? My assumptions about what my spouse is saying or feeling or requesting could be very different than what I'm actually hearing because I'm inferring something from what they did.
Yeah, that's a great tip if you find yourself in doing a lot of inferring as you're listening, is just, maybe I can clarify a little bit more. Maybe I can pause and just check in once in a while because I know I do this. So I'm going to check in and say, hey, I'm hearing this. I'm hearing you say this. I know I infer a lot. So I could be wrong and I'm just checking in. Is that accurate? Is this what you're really needing? Is this what you're really feeling? Is this what you're requesting? And then be open to being wrong because we are wrong a lot when we infer. And be willing to change that perspective based on the feedback that your partner gives you, and then trust what your partner says is true when they feed that back to you.
It sort of reminds me, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but I used to work with this commercial real estate agent, and he had this phrase, and I loved it. He used to say, I don't understand. And it was pretty harsh. You'd say something that you wanted, and he says, I don't understand.
He probably was a very literal listener.
And it wasn't until and so what it forced me to do in that situation was to get very specific. And maybe he only
because you were probably inferring.
Yeah, maybe he only brought that out just for me. Maybe that's why I heard it. But it trained me to get very, very specific with my request. So it was a little harsh at first to hear that, but then I just realized that was just the way that he was seeking clarity. So.
Well, and it was probably a miscommunication going on. You were probably, because you do infer a lot when you speak, and he was probably extremely literal. And so he was getting clarification.
Yeah, that was it. So when it comes to your speaking style, I think we need to work a little bit more on being clear, right? Because none of us are great readers, are great mind readers. And if we're making that bid for connection, dropping breadcrumbs, be clear about that bid for connection. If we're making a request to have our needs met, i.e. I'm thirsty, let's make it a clear request.
Yeah. I think this is something regardless of what you tend to prefer when you're speaking, I think it's good for all of us to just work on being more clear.
Yeah.
Especially with our bids, especially with our requests and our needs. Because as we said before, I think as a whole, when there's goodwill in a relationship, we want to respond positively to those bids for connection. We want to help our partner get their needs met. But if we're not hearing them, then we miss them. And that is predictive of whether a relationship is going to go well. And we talked about this 3 episodes ago.
Was it 3 already?
Yeah. It was called Crucial Conversations, Communicating Needs Without Starting a Fight. And we talked about the importance. I'd go back and listen to that episode if you haven't. But we talked about how to make requests clear and how to do it in a way that is respectful. And we talked about not being ambiguous, not being vague, not beating around the bush. So regardless of what you tend to be in your speaking style, we want to try to be more clear when we state what we want, stating what we want, not what we don't want. So go back and listen to that episode. It's really helpful.
Yeah. And a lot of people get hurt or upset when their needs aren't being met. And they're hurt and upset when they really haven't made their needs or their requests known or very clear.
Yes.
And some people can get resentful or angry that their partner doesn't plan date nights, but they never made those specific requests, and they didn't make it clear.
Yeah, I hear this a lot. Lots of different examples of that. But, like if you're frustrated that your partner hasn't helped around the house, they haven't planned a date night, they haven't planned a trip, they haven't done these things, but then we haven't made those requests clear, well, that's
not really fair.
It's not really
honestly
fair
to hold that against them, right?
Right. And I think we've heard so many times, I can't tell you how many times we've heard people say things like, well, if my partner loved me, then he or she would just know what it is that I need.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Boy, don't even get me
I
started on that
don't
one.
like that phrase.
Yeah.
Or, he or she should just be picking up on all of these hints. I'm dropping all these hints and they should just fulfill my needs without being told, And, I think I used to probably be a lot more that way. I think, some people think like, oh, I should be able to just say, I like flowers. And then poof, a bouquet of flowers shows up on the kitchen table and they're all arranged pretty. But that's not fair.
Yeah, I think it's time for us as couples to grow up a little bit and to realize that the answer to the problem is not going to be, quote, they should just know.
No.
Yeah, I think that we need to, as your relationship, and when we've talked about this, your relationship is a growing machine, right? It's going to grow you up if it will let you. And if you'll let it grow you past this, they should know, in air quotes.
That's pretty immature.
For whatever it is, they should just know that I love them. They should just know that I want the dishes done. They know that I like a clean house. They should just know. These statements are just fraught with all kinds of dangerous ramifications. And I think eliminating that entire sentence from your marital conversation is going to
be helpful,
is going to be more than helpful. I think that will take away just, hey, if you could eliminate one point of discontention in your relationship, let's just get rid of that. And hey, you guys won just by dropping that one from your repertoire of things that you like to say.
I like that. Let's just make our needs, our requests, and our communication as clear as we can be and let go of things like that, period.
Yeah. And there's this whole misconception that if I had asked for X and my partner doesn't do X, then it's not as meaningful as it was if they would have just, quote, thought about it and put the effort onto it without being asked. Again, they should just know.
They should just know again. Yeah. And as I was about to say a minute ago, I think I'm kind of guilty of doing that in the past early on in our relationship. So for example, if I had told Robert, I really like flowers.
You do?
And if, no, actually I don't, but let's just say.
Okay. But, I'm like, wait, am I missing something here?
But let's say I said to Robert, I really like flowers. It would be great if I could occasionally have flowers. It would be so romantic. It would make me feel really special to receive flowers. And, P.S. I actually don't. I'm not really a flower person. But let's say in that example, Robert was like, oh, good. She made a request for flowers. He runs out, he gets me flowers and brings them back home. There was a time when I probably would have scoffed at that, where I might have put him down either out loud or in my own mind, where I might have thought, well, okay, yeah, you got me flowers. Okay, whatever. If you really loved me and you really cared about me, then you would have just done these things without me having to ask you. And so even though I made the request and even though he went out and did the thing, I found fault in that. And the fact that I had to ask, I probably would have made that mean that, oh, well, he doesn't really care that much. It isn't as thoughtful. It isn't as romantic than if he had just gone out and done it without me asking.
He should have just known.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that is such a trap.
Yep.
The truth is, if we make clear requests and clearly state our wants and needs, which we've discussed in a lot of different episodes, and then if she puts in the time and effort to kind of meet those needs, it's actually an indication of her love, consideration, and care.
Yeah.
Just because I communicated those things first in no way changes the thoughtfulness of what she did, or even makes it less meaningful.
Exactly. Like what I just described, how maybe I used to be, that would be like a really immature position that I would have taken back then. So the going out and doing the thing that you requested really just means that you're loved.
Yeah. How awesome.
Yeah. So what are some takeaways from today's show?
Well, so here's some takeaways from today's show. Let's make clear requests. I know that's hard, but we've done an episode on how to make your request clear, right?
Go back and listen.
Let's make clear bids. Those are bids for connections. Let's be clear when we're dropping breadcrumbs instead of hints. Be careful when you're inferring and realize that you're going to get it wrong sometimes or always.
Mm-hmm.
And then eliminate the phrase, they should know, from your couple's vocabulary.
Yeah. And then again, be grateful for when our partner is responding to those attempts to connect, when they are positively responding to our requests, and appreciate them.
We're trying here.
Appreciate those. Even when you've had to ask for it, still appreciate it because they are showing love and care when they respond to our requests.
All right. Well, that was a lot. That was good. I liked that episode. So we want you to tell us what you thought about today's episode. So come over on social media this week and share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear with you and continue the conversation.
And once again, we're just really grateful for all of you and just ask that you continue to support the show. Remember that algorithm really does feed on those ratings and comments. And so for us to make a bigger impact in the world, we do actually need your continued support. So if you haven't, would you go show us a little love by leaving us a 5-star review and a comment?
More importantly, as always, if there was someone in your life that needs help in their relationship and maybe would benefit from this episode, would you just please share it with them?
And of course, be kind to each other this week. Take care of each other this week. Remember, it's the small things done often that makes the biggest difference.
Until next time.